Thank you for the invitation. I have a feeling that you try to match Muslim Interactive with the video professionalism. I try to speak in 30-second stances so that you can put it on TikTok. No, I'm not, but you know, we're getting there. So today I will talk about the financing of terrorism, but also the financing of extremism, because terrorism does not grow in thin air. It's always an ecosystem. And I'm very thankful to the colleagues who have given the lectures before me, because it became quite clear that there's never only a radicalization within just, 30 minutes watching 3 TikTok videos, but there's always an ecosystem, not only financing terrorism, but also financing NGOs, radicalization processes, news, and so on, in order then to radicalize young people and pave the ground for violence, let's say. So the agenda is first the sources of terrorism, so just that you hear them for once, it's not so important. Then extremism, and then some examples out of the practice, because I'm not an academic, I work in countering terrorism, the financing of terrorism, and then we get into the countermeasures. So sources of terrorism haven't changed over the last 100 years. Most of them are quite traditional. You have kidnappings and then demands for ransoms. You have drug smuggling, pacts with organized crime, all sorts of illicit activities to finance terrorism. Protection racketeering, Schutzgeld in German, but also in modern times, since the 70s, state sponsors of terrorism, namely the regime in Iran, but also Qatar, also to some lesser degree, some other states, like, for example, Turkey. It's not always the state itself financing those activities, although in the case of the regime in Iran, it very often is, but also private donors, for example, from the Gulf states. So we had a lot of private donors financing at least extremism from Saudi Arabia, less in recent years, but before that, yes. And some new challenges, which is fundraising campaigns via cryptocurrencies, crowdfunding, and more NGOs and relief organizations. Aid diversion plays a huge role in financing terrorism, not only in Gaza, which is probably the most known case now and most debated case, but also in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and so on. So the colleagues from the Counter-Extremism Project have done a whole set of talks on aid diversion, which you can look up also on YouTube, where you have a discussion, an in-depth discussion about the possibility that aid or humanitarian aid finances terrorism. The terrorist organizations with most funds control territory. So the methods I just mentioned are universal, but if you control territory, you have access to way more funds than smaller groups controlling trade routes or just small areas, which is taxes. For example, Hamas financed large parts of their operation through taxes. One of the examples best known is the Islamic State, also collecting taxes and customs and fees. But also now, for example, a terrorist group like the Taliban in Afghanistan have access to taxes and, of course, fees from NGOs operating in Afghanistan and natural resources, which is also the case for the Houthis, which makes them one of the 4 richest terrorist organizations in the world. Financial flows overlap somewhat with the sources of terrorist financing. So you see some already mentioned, so state financing, financing via state, crypto transactions, Hawala, which is an ancient system of transferring money where money is not physically or digitally transferred, but provided via some sort of hawaladas. They are trusted persons dividing funds between their communities, collecting them and paying them out, and communicating with their counterparts in other countries or parts of the country, which is very common in Afghanistan, Eritrea, and so on, so countries where the banking system is not developed. Salaries for preachers come very often from afar. That is the ecosystem, but also money is transferred via criminal channels. And there's also an overlap between organized crime, drug trafficking, antiquities, smuggling, things like that, very often used and more often used now to conduct terrorist operations. For example, the regime in Iran is hiring criminal gangs to conduct operations. And they're not only small operations like people spying on Jewish institutions in Germany, but also, for example, they hired a criminal clan who is Irish. They're not only Arabic clans, they're also Irish clans called the Kilinans, and they provided Hezbollah with flights of airplane flights, for example. They purchased airplanes, they purchased chips, so really huge operations conducted specifically for Hezbollah by an Irish clan, which organizes trafficking of drugs mainly. So you see an overlap there. And there's also more and more proceeds not only flowing into Europe, but going out of Europe. I already mentioned aid diversion, but more and more it's also official NGOs operating, for example, in Gaza and overlapping with terrorist organizations. I live in Switzerland. Switzerland, for example, defunded I think up to 20 NGOs after October 7, because then they realized they have ties to terrorist organizations. But before that, for years and years, they were officially funded by the Swiss state. There's also, of course, terrorist-related NGOs. Islamic Relief was already mentioned. It's banned in Israel because it has ties to Hamas. There are other charities collecting money in Europe, like Baraka Charity, with ties to Hezbollah, also transferring millions for legitimate causes. So they provide food, they deliver medical aid and so on, but part of that also goes to terrorist organizations. And then flows within Europe, also not outside of Europe, but within Europe, there's modern communication systems that can be used to finance terrorism on a smaller scale, like computer games. VAT fraud is very, very known to finance terrorist activities, also on the border of Germany and Belgium. So you get the idea. There's an overlap between money laundering, criminal activity, and terrorism financing. Now we get to the ecosystem, and I just took one example out of Frankfurt because it happened here. I think it was last year, a small conference that was supposed to happen at this university, but then was pushed out of university, luckily, where you have organizers organizing a seemingly academic debate talking Palestine about the discrimination against Palestinians. And the interesting for me was that they even publicly said on their website that the funds they were collecting through a crowdfunding site go to a charity, and if you see that charity, you immediately know that it has ties to Hamas. And nothing happens. So you see that there's an overlap on the ecosystem side of people promoting or supporting terrorist ideas, or at least legitimizing them or explaining the idea behind, for example, Palestinian terrorists, but then actively also collecting money and providing it to an NGO who might use it to funnel it to terrorist organizations. And we see that more and more. So we have to talk about the ecosystem if we want to effectively prevent terrorism financing. And how does the ecosystem finances itself? A terrorist attack is quite cheap. Either you buy a knife, you rent a car, you plow into masses. Even sophisticated terrorist attacks only take a couple of thousands of euros. But the ecosystem really needs money, because you need money to pay the salaries of employees, you need money for publications, you have broadcasting channels like Al Jazeera. So it's a lot. The volume of money going into the ecosystem of violent extremism is vaster and larger. The amount needed is larger than that going into terrorism. You know, for example, the Qatar papers who tracked down 80 million. There's another study commissioned by the European Union on anti-feminism, which was concerned about anti-abortion activism, which tracked more than 700 million euros from 50 to 60 NGOs. So you see the amount that is needed. Well, some of the NGOs also get state funding from foreign donors. A lot get state funding from our own governments for prevention work, for de-radicalization, legitimate causes like climate activities and so on. But also some of those NGOs build up their own businesses. So either they publish publications, we've already seen some of them, if they sell them, they provide halal certificates, tourism, Hajj and Umrah travel is a very common thing. They collect money via social media, but they also run hotels and so on. So they have legitimate businesses funding the activity very often. And of course, donations and fees. So the intersections go from terrorism to extremism, which is legal, but still, being supervised somewhat by our states, to legitimate activism, for example, educating people about climate change and so on. So it overlaps gradually, and we see a whole structure that some of you already mentioned. I've taken an example here from a non-Islamist terrorist group, just to give you an idea. So if you pull one string, whatever string you get, you generally unravel a whole system. Whatever you pull out, if it's the Islamophobia report, and then you have 10 to 30 organizations popping up behind that. If you look at any event whatsoever, and I just took a small part of a briefing I wrote and smashed it into an AI to show you a graph. And the story behind that is I came across an article in Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is a renowned German newspaper, about a police officer who was severely injured during a Nakba demonstration, so a pro-Palestinian demonstration, and he was severely injured. And this newspaper published an article alleging that his injuries came because he himself beat up the protesters. So he's the perpetrator, not the victim. And I immediately recognized the one organization analyzing the material of the demonstration. And that is a British organization called, in German, Forensis. And this British organization is known for architectural analyzing. So they take visual evidence, cut it up, and then give it a message. And this organization itself is part of Al-Haq, another organization whose general director has ties to the PFLP, which is a Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization banned in the EU. And if you look at that organization, you will see that Forensic Architecture opened an office in Berlin together with another foundation in 2020, which dedicates a huge amount of its money and work to stopping any arms deliveries to Israel. And that organization is financed by a German philanthropist, a sponsor, who also finances legitimate journalistic work like Correctiv. And you go through that, and somehow you end up, if you go through the steps, from legitimate activism to extremism to terrorism support and terrorism links. And that one of those foundations who followed up after that report in charging the police officer, dragging him in front of a court, is a foundation from the Netherlands who provides funding for every pro-Palestinian activist who is dragged in front of a court in Germany. But not only that, they also provide funding for strategic litigation. So we heard already that a lot of us had trouble being dragged in front of a court. Most of these cases are financed by that institution from the Netherlands, and this institution, for example, has a member of Jordan on its board. It's a woman from Jordan who owns several hotels. So, you know, depending on which thread you pull, you always end up with the next and the next and the next. Just to give you an idea. I skipped that because it's another network analysis. On those kind of demonstrations, which call themselves pro-Palestinian, but in general are pro-terrorist demonstrations, money is collected. So it's one of the examples for small sort of crowdfundings and so on. Mostly it's QR codes. Switzerland is always more professionalized, so if you are in Switzerland on a demonstration, you can directly transfer it via Twint, which is something like PayPal, so you can transfer the money directly and you don't see where it's going. And here on demonstrations, you also have QR codes where you can just directly donate money. And on the right side, you see a group from Switzerland, a leftist communist group, who collected $3,000 and said it's for humanitarian purposes in Lebanon. And if you look closely, they delivered it in person. They delivered it in an office of a so-called humanitarian foundation with PFLP figureheads on the wall. So these pictures prove that they're part of the PFLP. They know what they're doing because they blurred their faces themselves. I didn't do that. They did that themselves to protect their identities. And that sort of ecosystem, providing finance for at least dodgy motives, also radicalizes in a way that they advertise or mark some targets in Europe. For example, a CEO of a Swiss company being put on social media as the enemy of the month, with his full name, with his full face. And it's not only on social media. The same surrounding in Brussels placated the faces, the addresses, and the full names of employees of a US think tank that advocates for Israel in front of mosques. So you have now a surrounding that is financed, and they placate people on walls in front of mosques, so in the hope that somehow they become targets. And you all know that one of these strategies was successful with the murder of 2 employees of the Israeli embassy in Washington. And we see that also here. And in Switzerland, we had attacks in the last 2-3 years of PFLP affiliated organizations and members who overlap with Islamist organizations against the US consulate, against newspaper outlets. Most of them were not against persons, not yet, but they destroy property, which is the first step then of increasing violence. This is another example. It's a German bank with ties to Hamas. It was quite known that they had ties to Hamas. It's a KT Bank is the daughter of a Turkish bank, who's the daughter of a Kuwaiti bank. And it was alleged that they had ties to Hamas. And after October 7, they were put under supervision. And in the end, they had to pay a fine of 600,000 euros, which hurts a bit, but doesn't really prevent them from doing what they're doing. So, but just to show you another example. Impediments, why is it so difficult to counter that sort of financing? Well, a colleague of mine did a very thorough research asking legal entities in Europe about the cases of the overlap of terrorism and organized crime. Most of them even refused to share information. So the first thing is that nobody wants to talk about it. It's very difficult to share information, and they're very reluctant to speak about it publicly if they speak about it at all. That is a study which found the cases related to terrorism financing in Germany who went into proceeding, went in front of a court between 2018 to 2020. So they found nearly 1,000 relevant cases of alleged terrorism financing. They could identify 773 cases linked to specific types of terrorism, most of them related to Islamism, 76%, and found out that less than 4% of those dragged in front of a court were convicted. And the reason for that is that in Germany, to put it bluntly, you have to write on the transaction, please build a bomb, to convict somebody of terrorism financing. The laws are so strict that you cannot, if you cannot prove that this specific money, these 10 euros, go into a terrorism act, then you will not be convicted of terrorism financing. You might be convicted of tax evasion, of illicit financial activity, of drug dealing, of money laundering. Money laundering also not very much, actually, but not of terrorism financing. Because, you know, people are very much protected against that. These are the legal implications why this is. So first of all, if you are a German police officer investigating a terrorist financing case, you need a concrete evidence, Vortat in German. Otherwise, you're not permitted by a judge to investigate. So if you cannot say, this is a drug dealer, I have proof, I have a picture of him giving the drug, I have the depot, whatever, there is no judge who will give you the permission to investigate. So if you start to investigate and say, I have a suspicion that there's terrorist activity going on, the judge will ask you, where's the evidence? And if you say, I have none, then he will say, then you cannot investigate, which then, you know, brings you to turn in circles, because how can you collect evidence if you're not allowed to investigate? So that is one of the main hindrances to investigate terrorism financing. Another one is we have no reversal of the burden of proof. Italy has a system where if they confiscate property, the one who owns the property has to prove where the money is coming from for the property. We do not have that. So for example, in the case in Berlin where 77 objects were confiscated, they had to give them back in the end to the criminal clan who owns the buildings, because they said officially we do not own them. It's a person in Lebanon who owns them. And then the investigation was dead because they couldn't force them to provide proof for the financing of those houses mainly. What can we do to counter terrorism financing? Well, I disagree with Florence. I think bans on organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood work, not so much because they cannot circumvent the financing. So if you lock one account, then you open another one, but it disrupts the ecosystem. So you have to move from France to Belgium. And most of all, and most important of all, political entities will be very reluctant to deal with you. Because once you're banned, you get a very bad name. One of the examples for that is Samidoun, who was banned after October 7th, also an organization of the PFLP. And before October 7th, before the ban, they worked together with a leftist organization called Rote Hilfe. They still work with that organization in Switzerland, Secours Rouge, but they don't work together, at least officially, anymore in Germany. So at least it disturbs the ecosystem and it makes people be aware of the problem so they cannot, go out. But the most important thing, I think, would be transparency regulations for all NGOs. Doesn't matter if it's a sport club, a youth club, if you're a painters club, whatever it is, up from a certain level. If it's, for example, like in France, more than 200,000 euros, 253,000 to be exact, you have to publish where your finances are coming from. Every transfer above 10,000 euros should be declared, because the transparency, the shedding of light on structures who want to remain in the dark will show us what I showed you now with this graph, the structure of the ecosystem of terrorism, and make it easier at least to politically advocate against them. And also, when they are transparent enough, you can at least argue against them. Because now they can always say, I'm a de-radicalization project and so on. And the strategy, especially of the Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar, is to create a problem to then offer to solve the problem. And you can disrupt that strategy by shedding light on their structures. We need to think data protection, of course, so that investigators can investigate. Funding tools for law research, for example, AI for law research in Germany. Most of Verfassungsschutz, for example, do not have the funds to invest in AI, but also prosecutors do not have the funds. More international cooperation.